The whole territory of New Mexico had tried to marry off Peter Bristol, and every last one of those women had ridden back to Santa Fe with nothing but dust on their boots and a bruised sense of pride. It was the year 1878, and the town of Redstone Crossing sat at the edge of the desert like a stubborn old man who refused to move despite every wind and drought and hard season that came at him. The town had a livery stable, a church with a crooked steeple, a general store run by a man named Elias Holt who kept a ledger so precise it was practically scripture, a saloon called the Copper Penny that served warm beer and cold indifference in equal measure, and a sheriff's office that had seen 3 sheriffs in the last 4 years. 2 had moved on, 1 had been carried out. The 4th sheriff was Peter Bristol, and he had been in Redstone Crossing for 2 years, which made him practically a permanent fixture by local standards. Peter Bristol was 31 years old, 6 feet, and 1 inch of lean muscle and quiet certainty, with dark brown hair that curled just slightly at his collar when the summer heat got bad and gray eyes that people tended to remember long after they had forgotten everything else about him. He was not a cold man. Anyone who knew him would say that without hesitation. He laughed at a good joke, helped the Morno family haul water from the creek when their well dried up, read books he ordered from a catalog back east, and made the kind of coffee that men rode 20 miles out of their way for on a cold morning. He was not cold. But he was alone, and he seemed perfectly content to remain that way, and that drove the town of Redstone Crossing absolutely mad. The trouble, as the town collectively understood it, had started about 18 months into his tenure. Mary Applegate, whose father owned the flour mill, had begun leaving fresh-baked bread on his doorstep every morning. He had thanked her sincerely and continued eating alone. Then there had been Agnes Flint, a widow from the next county over who had been brought over specifically by the town's informal matchmaking committee, a group that operated mainly out of the back corner of Elias Holt's general store on Tuesday afternoons. Agnes was a fine-looking woman with a sharp wit and a solid parcel of land, and Peter had spent a very polite dinner with her, praised her cooking, walked her to her horse, and sent her home. After Agnes had come Dolores Reyes, who was beautiful and funny, and had apparently made every man in the Southern Territory consider, abandoning whatever sense they possessed, and Peter had liked her well enough to play 3 rounds of cards with her at the Copper Penny, but had not kissed her hand when she left, which she said she took as a very clear message. The town had tried 5 women in total. 5 different women, varying in age and temperament and circumstance, all chosen with care and optimism by the committee in the back of Elias Holt's store. 5 women had come, and 5 women had gone, and Peter Bristol continued to eat alone and sleep alone and wake up alone in the small house behind the sheriff's office that he had painted white 2 summers ago because the walls were getting on his nerves. People had theories. Elias Holt believed he was still in love with some woman back in Missouri, where he had come from. The preacher, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Carr, believed Peter simply had not met the right person yet, and that God had a plan and they should all leave the man alone. Martha Holt, Elias' wife, who had been the primary architect of every single matchmaking attempt and who considered the whole enterprise to be a matter of civic duty, believed that Peter Bristol was stubborn as a Missouri mule and that what he needed was simply the correct woman, properly presented. She had not given up. She was already writing letters. What none of them knew, and what Peter Bristol had told precisely nobody, was that he had been engaged once. Back in Missouri, in a small town called Cordell, there had been a woman named Virginia who had dark hair and a laugh that filled up whatever room she was in. They had been engaged for 4 months. Then the man she had actually loved, a merchant who had gone west to make his fortune, had come back. Peter had watched Virginia's face change when she saw that man ride into town, and he had known with a clarity that required no words at all that there was nothing for him in Cordell anymore. He had given Virginia back her ring with no argument and no bitterness, because he loved her enough not to trap her, and he had ridden west and kept riding until the desert opened up around him, and he found Redstone Crossing, which needed a sheriff more than it needed anything else. He did not think about Virginia with pain anymore. That surprised him sometimes. What he carried instead was a kind of careful reserve, a quiet but firm understanding that he would not enter into something halfway. He would not be convenient or practical. He would not marry because the territory thought he should, or because Martha Holt had appointed herself an instrument of providence. If there was a woman for him, he would know it, and he would not compromise on that knowing for anything. And since he had not known it yet, he was content to wait, and the town could mind its own business, which it showed absolutely no inclination to do. The morning Catherine Rourke arrived in Redstone Crossing, Peter Bristol was fixing the lock on the jail cell door because the mechanism had been sticking for a week, and it was making him unreasonably irritated. He heard the stagecoach come in the way he always heard it, through the thin walls of the sheriff's office, the creak and rumble and the driver calling out his warning shout so people would clear the road. He did not look up from the lock. He heard the boots on the boardwalk outside, the greetings exchanged between the driver and Elias Holt, who came out of the general store for every stage arrival because he was waiting on a shipment of dry goods. He heard the ordinary shuffle and movement of people getting on and off and going about their business, and he kept his attention on the lock. He did not hear about Catherine Rourke until that afternoon, and not from Martha Holt's committee, which was the thing that made all the difference. He heard about her from Tom Birch, who was 15 years old, and whose main occupation in life was knowing everything that happened in Redstone Crossing before anyone else did. Tom came in around 2 o'clock with a tin pail containing Peter's lunch from the Copper Penny kitchen, which was a service Tom had arranged himself in exchange for being allowed to sit in the sheriff's office and listen to whatever interesting things were said there, a bargain Peter had accepted because he had eaten cold and forgotten lunches for long enough. "There's a new woman in town," Tom said, setting the pail down and helping himself to the stool in the corner. "There are several women in town," Peter said. "It is a town. A new one came on the stage. She is not one of Mrs. Holt's, I can tell you that because I asked." Peter looked up from his food. "You asked Martha Holt directly whether she arranged a woman to come here." Tom shrugged with the easy confidence of youth. Mrs. Holt looked real confused. "I think if she had arranged it, she would have been pleased about it. She was not pleased. She looked like she was hearing about it for the first time, which means she is going to be in a state about it all week." Peter considered this information, decided it was not his concern, and returned to his lunch. "She checked into Mrs. Garza's boarding house," Tom continued, undeterred. "She had a leather trunk and a satchel, and she carried the satchel herself even though Rodriguez from the livery tried to take it. She is a redhead, real redheaded, the kind where you notice it." "Tom, I am just reporting." "Report something useful. Has anyone given you trouble at the North Well?" Tom reported on the North Well situation, which was genuinely a small dispute about water rights between two neighboring homesteads, and Peter listened and made notes and finished his lunch, and he did not think about the red-headed woman who had not been sent by Martha Holt. He thought about her at around 4:30 in the afternoon, when he was walking the town's main street on his afternoon round, which was something he did every day because Redstone Crossing had a way of brewing trouble that always looked harmless until it suddenly wasn't. He was passing the general store when the door opened, and she came out. She nearly walked directly into him, and she would have if he had not stepped back fast enough. She stopped, shifted the satchel on her shoulder, and looked up at him, and Tom Birch had not been wrong about the hair. It was the deep, rich copper color of autumn leaves on a Missouri hillside, and it was pinned up under a practical wide-brimmed hat that she clearly wore for function rather than fashion. Her eyes were a shade of green that startled him, not because they were unusual, but because of the quality of attention in them. The way she looked at him with a direct, unhurried assessment that he recognized. because it was exactly what he himself did when he was trying to understand a situation. She was not young in the reckless, unformed sense. She was somewhere around 27 or 28, he guessed, with a face that had seen weather and work and probably some sorrow, but that wore all of it well. She was wearing a plain dark blue dress with trail dust on the hem, and she was not the least bit apologetic about it. "I am sorry," she said. "I was not watching where I was going. Are you all right?" Her voice had a slight Irish lilt underneath the American flattening of it, the kind that happened when someone had grown up hearing the old country talked about more than they had actually seen it. "Fine," he said. "I am Sheriff Bristol." She looked at his badge with what seemed like genuine interest rather than the particular form of feminine nervousness that badges sometimes produced. "Catherine Rourke," she said, and shook his hand like a person who had been shaking hands with people all her life without being told it was unusual. "I just arrived today. I came to see Frank Dorsey about a claim." Peter had not been expecting that. "What claim?" "My father filed on 40 acres east of here a year and a half ago. He died 6 months ago. The claim was in his name and I need to get it transferred. Mr. Dorsey is the land agent, I was told." Peter felt the careful professional attention settle into place around him, the part of him that was always the sheriff even when he was off duty. Frank Dorsey moved on about 4 months back. His office was taken over by a man named Alton Marsh who came down from Santa Fe. Something shifted in her face, a quick involuntary tightening that she controlled almost immediately. "I see," she said. "Thank you for telling me. I will find Mr. Marsh. He is usually in his office until 5. Brown building, end of the street past the farrier." "Thank you, Sheriff Bristol." She walked past him and he turned and watched her go for exactly 2 seconds before turning back to his own direction. He told himself he was noting that she seemed like a capable woman who knew her business. That was true. He told himself it was nothing more than that. That, he was less certain about. Alton Marsh's office was a study in deliberate disorder, the kind of mess that made it difficult for anyone to verify anything because nothing was ever where it was supposed to be. Catherine Rourke had dealt with men like Alton Marsh before, in county offices back in Ohio where she had come from originally, men who used confusion as a form of control. She sat in the wooden chair across from his desk and watched him thumb through papers. He clearly was not reading, and she kept her voice even. "The original filing was made by my father, Patrick Rourke, in the spring of 1877, she said. "He sent me copies of all the documentation before he died. I have them here." Marsh was a lean, unhealthy-looking man with pale eyes that moved too quickly. He was perhaps 45, with a quality of practiced boredom that she did not trust. "Claims get complicated when the original filer passes," he said. "There are processes. It could take months. The Homestead Act allows for transfer to surviving family members. I am his surviving family member. You would need witnesses. You would need verification. It takes time, Miss Rourke." "How much time?" she said. "And what exactly does it take?" He named a figure. It was not, he was careful to say, an official fee. It was a processing cost. She looked at him for a long time without speaking, and he looked away first, which told her everything she needed to know about him. She left his office with all her papers still in her satchel and her money still in her coat pocket, and she stood on the boardwalk in the late afternoon light and breathed in the dry desert air and thought about her options. She had come a very long way for 40 acres. The money her father had left her was enough to get there and start, not enough to be wasted on a man whose processing costs were a polite form of theft. She needed help, and she needed to be careful about who she asked, because she had learned over the years that help in an unfamiliar place always came with a price that was not always stated up front. She thought about the sheriff. There had been something in the way he looked at her, a steadiness that was not threatening, just present, the kind of attention that meant he was actually registering what he saw rather than what he expected to see. It was not a common quality. She decided to trust it enough to try. She found him on the main street again, not because she had gone looking, but because the town was small, and the man was apparently not the type who hid inside. He was talking to an older man outside the farrier's when she approached, and he turned slightly as she came near in a way that told her he had heard her boots on the boardwalk before she was visible, which told her something about his habits. The older man tipped his hat and moved on, with the practiced tact of someone who had been taking social cues for decades. "Sheriff," she said, "I have a question, and I want to ask it honestly. Alton Marsh told me the claim transfer would require an unofficial processing cost. I am asking you directly whether that is a legitimate thing, or whether it is something I should be worried about." Peter Bristol looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes, and then he said, "It is not legitimate. There is no processing cost for a family transfer under the Homestead Act." "That is what I thought. Marsh has been in that office 4 months, and I have had 2 complaints about him already. The problem is that the complaints have to go to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, and the process takes time, and in the meantime he is still the agent of record. So he can keep doing it until someone with authority in Santa Fe tells him to stop or removes him." She absorbed this with the quiet efficiency of someone who was used to absorbing unpleasant facts. How long would a letter to Santa Fe take? To get there, 3 or 4 days; to get a response, weeks, maybe a month. She looked down the street toward Marsh's brown building, which was now shuttered for the evening, and then looked back at him. "I have enough money to stay at the boarding house for 2 weeks, perhaps a little more if I am careful." "Mrs. Garza's rates are fair," Peter said. "She will work with you if you need to." He paused. "I can write the letter to Santa Fe myself." A letter from a county sheriff carries more weight than a complaint from a private citizen. That is not how it should be, but it is how it is. She looked at him again with that same direct, unhurried quality, and he felt it land somewhere in the center of his chest, that attention like a hand placed quietly on a door. "Why would you do that?" she said. "Not suspicious exactly, just honest, just the real question." "Because it is the right thing," he said. "And because Marsh has been running that office like it is his personal bank, and I have been waiting for a reason to push back officially." She almost smiled. The almost was somehow more interesting than the smile would have been. "Then I appreciate it," she said, "and I will not take up any more of your time tonight. Miss Rourke." She had turned to go, and she turned back. "Mrs. Garza keeps her doors locked at 9. If you are not back before then, knock 3 times slow and she will open it. She will not say it is a rule, but it is." Something in her face softened just at the edges, like a painting that had been done in hard angles and then touched very lightly with warm light. "Thank you," she said, and went. Peter stood on the main street of Redstone Crossing in the going dark and understood, with no drama and no fanfare, that something had changed in the composition of his days. He did not examine it. He walked back to his office, sat down at his desk, and wrote a very thorough letter to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, citing specific violations of the Federal Homestead Act and requesting an immediate review of Alton Marsh's conduct. He made it polite, but made it impossible to ignore. He sealed it and set it on the edge of the desk for the morning stage. Then he sat for a while in the quiet of his office and thought about Green Eyes and the way she had said, "Why would you do that?" and the way he had found he very much wanted to give her an honest answer. The next morning, Catherine was up before the sun. It was a habit she had formed in childhood on her father's farm in Ohio, up with the light change in the sky rather than the actual light, the gray-blue hour that belonged to no one and everyone. She dressed quietly and went down to the kitchen where Mrs. Garza, a compact, practical woman in her 50s with strong hands and a face that recorded everything without necessarily commenting on it, was already making coffee. "You sleep all right?" Mrs. Garza asked. "I did," Catherine said, which was true. The desert quiet was different from the Ohio quiet and different again from the Cincinnati street noise she had endured for 2 years when she had been working in a textile office after her mother died and before her father's letter had come telling her about the land claim. The desert was not silent exactly. It had sounds. They were just different sounds. She had found them restful. She helped Mrs. Garza set the breakfast table because she was that kind of person, and because sitting idle while someone else worked made her uncomfortable. Over coffee and biscuits, she learned that Mrs. Garza had come to New Mexico territory 12 years ago with her husband, who had built the boarding house and then died of a fever 3 years later, and that she had kept the house going by herself, which in Mrs. Garza's telling was simply something that had needed doing. She did not describe it as brave or exceptional. Catherine respected that. "You know the sheriff?" Catherine asked, more casually than she felt. Mrs. Garza's expression did not change, but something moved behind her eyes. "Bristol. Since he came 2 years ago, good man, honest, does not ask for what he has not earned. He wrote a letter for me last night to Santa Fe about the land agent. Marsh, Mrs. Garza said the name the way you would say the name of a food that had made you sick. Bristol has been watching him. He does not move without something to stand on, but he moves when he has it. Has he always been like that? Careful. I think careful is what some men choose when they have been careless before and did not like the result," Mrs. Garza said, with the particular wisdom of someone who had made the same observation about human nature from many angles over many years. She poured more coffee. "He is alone too much, but that is his business, not mine." Catherine thought about that. She thought about a man who wrote thorough official letters at night because it was the right thing to do, who knew the exact rules of a woman's boarding house, who stepped back to avoid a collision with a stranger on a boardwalk, and then stood there steady and present while she looked at him. She thought about being 30 years old, which she was, and about the years since her mother died and her father went west with a dream about land, and about working in the textile office with the constant smell of machine oil and the foreman who thought being pleasant to young women was the same thing as being kind to them. She thought about arriving in a desert town with a leather trunk and a satchel and a set of documents and a problem. She had not come here for a man. She had come here for 40 acres and the life she had planned with her father, which she now intended to build alone because life had taken the other option away. She was clear about that. She was also 30 years old and not interested in pretending she had not noticed Peter Bristol, or in pretending that noticing him felt like the previous 5 times she had noticed a man and thought maybe, and then found out, slowly and disappointingly, that maybe was not enough. She went out after breakfast to look at the town in the morning. It was a different creature in the early hours, when the desert light was still golden rather than white, when the dust had not yet been raised and the street was quiet. She walked the length of it, counted the buildings the way she always counted things because she liked to know what she was working with. She stood at the east edge of town and looked out at the flat land that became low, scrubby hills in the far distance and tried to imagine 40 acres out there. Tried to imagine a house, a kitchen garden, an orchard if the water allowed it, maybe a small herd just enough. She was standing there still, hat brim tilted against the morning light, when she heard boots on the hard ground behind her and turned. Peter Bristol was coming from the direction of the livery, carrying his hat in one hand, his dark hair loose in the morning before he had put himself together for the day. He had not shaved yet. He looked younger without the careful authority of the badge and the set jaw. He stopped a few feet away and looked out at the same horizon she had been looking at. "Checking on your land," he said, "trying to see it from here. It is about 4 miles east according to the filing documents, past the dry creek bed, the one with the cottonwoods." She turned to look at him. "You know it. I know most of the land in the county. It is part of the job knowing who is where and what belongs to what. That parcel your father filed on has good soil, runs up against a secondary aquifer. You can get water there if you dig the right depth." She turned back to the horizon with this new information fitting into the picture she was building. An aquifer. Water was everything out here. She had known it intellectually before she came, had read what she could find about New Mexico territory, but knowing it in her body was different, standing in the already warm morning air and feeling her mouth dry out and understanding that water was not a convenience but a foundation. "When did you come from Ohio?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "Mrs. Garza Tom Birch, actually. He is extremely well informed. I came from Ohio originally. I have been in Cincinnati for 2 years. She paused. How did you know it was Ohio? The way you talk, he said. There is a particular sound to it. I grew up in Missouri. The vowels are similar. She almost smiled again, that same almost from the night before that was becoming something she was aware of as a specific quality of expression, a brightness held just back from fully showing itself. Are you going to walk me out to the claim? She said and surprised herself. He looked at her for a moment in the early light. Not today. I have business in town, but I could on Saturday if you wanted to know what you are working with. Saturday, she said and nodded, and they stood for another moment looking out at the same horizon, which felt, in a way she could not have explained to anyone, like something that had been decided without words. The week that followed had a shape to it that Catherine had not anticipated. She had thought she would be doing nothing but waiting, and there was some waiting, it was true, but it turned out that Redstone Crossing did not entirely permit idleness in someone with her particular kind of energy. She helped Mrs. Garza with the boarding house garden on Tuesday, not because she was asked, but because she saw the weeding needed doing, and the tomato plants needed staking, and her hands needed work. Mrs. Garza let her do it without ceremony, and then fed her an enormous dinner as a form of gratitude that required no acknowledgement from either of them. On Wednesday, she went into Elias Holt's general store to buy a few necessities, and fell into a 3-hour conversation with Elias and his wife Martha about the practicalities of homesteading in the eastern reaches of the county. A conversation that she found genuinely useful despite Martha's absolutely transparent attempts to work questions about Peter Bristol's domestic habits into the discussion at irregular intervals. Catherine answered the direct questions honestly and deflected the indirect ones with a politeness so seamless that Martha did not catch on until it was almost over. He is a wonderful man, Martha said for the second time when Catherine was putting her small purchases in her satchel. Very steady, very capable, the sort of man who would make a real partner. I am sure he would, Catherine said pleasantly. I will see you tomorrow, Mrs. Holt. Thank you for the advice about the soil amendments. Outside, she breathed in the warm afternoon air and felt something close to amusement, and then felt the amusement tip over into something more honest. She was thinking about him more than was warranted by a single conversation and a promise of a Saturday walk. She was thinking about the way he had said there is a particular sound to it, and about the steadiness of him that was not the blankness of a man who had closed himself off, but something else, something more deliberate and more private. She went by the sheriff's office that evening, not because she had a reason but because she had told herself she needed to ask about the letter to Santa Fe and whether he had received any preliminary word, which was a reason, technically. He was sitting at his desk with a book open and a lamp burning, and he looked up when she knocked on the door frame and did not hide the fact that he was reading, which she liked. Some men would have closed the book immediately as if being caught thinking were an embarrassing condition. I wanted to ask about the letter, she said. I know it is probably too early for any response. It is, he said. Stage comes in on Monday and Thursday. Today is Wednesday. We would not have anything until Monday at the earliest, and even then it would just be confirmation of receipt. She nodded. He had not invited her in, but the door was open and she stayed in the doorway, which felt like the right geography for this particular conversation. What are you reading? He held the book up. It was a volume of natural philosophy, which surprised her enough that it must have shown. Did you think it would be wanted posters? He said, and there was something in his voice that was dry and warm at the same time, a register she had not quite heard from him before. No, she said honestly. I thought it might be legal code. He looked down at the book. I read that too, but not for pleasure. He paused. What do you read? Everything I can get, she said. In Cincinnati, I went to the public library twice a week. It was the best thing about living there. Holt's store keeps a small shelf of books in the back. He gets a shipment once a month. You might find something. She filed that away. Thank you, she said. She was about to turn and go, and then she did not. "Sheriff." "Peter," he said. She looked at him. "If we are going to walk out to your land on Saturday," he said carefully, "it seems like a long way to go with no first name." The warmth that moved through her was quiet and certain, and she did not try to name it exactly, just let it happen. "Catherine," she said. "Good night, Peter." "Good night, Catherine." She went back to the boarding house in the warm dark and sat on the small wooden chair in her room and looked at the wall and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something was beginning rather than ending. Saturday came with a clear sky and the particular quality of desert morning that she was starting to recognize as beautiful rather than harsh. The way the light was absolute and honest and showed you exactly what everything was. She met Peter at the edge of town at 7 in the morning, as they had agreed, both of them on horseback. She on the roan mare she had rented from Rodriguez at the livery, who had been efficient and fair, and who had not tried to manage her saddling of the horse, which she had done herself without being asked. Peter was on a gray horse with a calm disposition and white stockings, and he nodded when she rode up, and they went east without much preliminary, which she appreciated. The ride was 4 miles, and they took it at a comfortable pace and talked. Really talked, the way she had not talked with anyone in longer than she could immediately calculate. He told her about coming to New Mexico territory from Missouri, about the year he had spent in Colorado before that, about how he had ended up in Redstone Crossing, because the county commissioner had written to the marshal's office for a qualified man, and Peter had been the one who was free and willing. He said it plainly, without decoration, and she understood from the plainness that Missouri and Colorado and the choices that led to all of it were not nothing, but they were also not something he was ready to explain in full, and she did not press. She told him about her father, about Patrick Rourke, who had come from Ireland as a young man and had farmed Ohio land for 30 years, and who had, in his 62nd year, when her mother was 2 years dead, and the Ohio winters were wearing on his bones and his blood, gotten it into his head that he wanted land in the West. Not because he had to, but because he had always wanted to, had always had a map of the territory in his head from reading, and the land was cheap under the Homestead Act and the West was still being made, and he thought he might make something in it. She had tried to go with him, and he had said, "No, wait, let me get something established and then come," and she had respected that because he was her father and because he was 62 and still fully himself, and so she had waited. The letter came 6 months after he filed, saying the land was better than he had hoped, and the climate was a revelation, and he was building a 1-room shelter, and the soil held water well enough for a kitchen garden. And then another letter 4 months after that, shorter, saying he was not quite well. And then a letter from a neighbor, a homesteader named Williams, who was 3 miles east, saying that Patrick Rourke had died quietly in his sleep on a November night, and that he had been a good neighbor and a decent man, and that he had left everything to his daughter in a will that was now lodged with the county. She told Peter all of this in the morning light while their horses moved through the scrub brush, and the distant mountains sat blue and still on the horizon, and she told it without weeping, because she had already wept all the weeping she had, and what was left was just the fact of it, which she could hold without breaking. Peter listened the way he seemed to do everything, with his full attention, and without making her feel that the attention was a performance. When she finished, he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "He sounds like someone worth riding 4 miles for." She felt the truth of that lodge somewhere behind her sternum. He was, she said. The land was extraordinary. She had not let herself hope too much, because hoping too much was how you got to disappointment. But when they rode up onto the parcel and she saw the line of cottonwood trees marking the dry creek bed, and the way the land rose slightly to the east, giving a natural slope for drainage, and the quality of the soil when she dismounted and picked up a handful and felt it, she understood what her father had felt when he arrived here. It was not just adequate land. It was good land. It had been worth wanting, Peter stood back and let her walk it, which was the right instinct. She paced the rough boundaries the way her father would have, checking the markers he had set, the small cairns of stones at each corner, already weathered but still clear. She stood in the middle of it and turned in a slow circle and felt the size of the dream settle into the size of the actual place. "The aquifer runs under the northeast corner," Peter said, when she came back to where he was standing with the horses. "If you dig a well about 20 feet southeast of the largest cottonwood, you should hit good water at about 40 feet. The Williams place, 3 miles east, their well is on the same system. You know a great deal about the water table for a man whose job is keeping order. Keeping order requires knowing what people are fighting over," he said. "Water is the most common reason. I learned it because I kept seeing it come up." She looked at the largest cottonwood, measured the distance with her eye. 40 feet, she said. "That is a great deal of digging." "It is, but it can be done in stages." She looked at him. "You have done this before, helped someone establish a claim." "Twice," he said. "There was a family, the Navarros, 4 miles north. I helped them in my first year here, and a man named Garrett came through the year after. I helped him survey before he filed." She understood something then about who this man was, not all of it, not even most of it, but enough to confirm the shape of it. He was someone who acted because it was right to act, without categorizing it as exceptional or deserving of notice. He helped because the help was needed, and he was capable and available. He had written her letter to Santa Fe for the same reason he knew about the aquifer, because he was paying attention, because it was part of taking care of a place. They ate the lunch she had packed, sitting on the ground with their backs against the largest cottonwood while the horses grazed nearby, and the conversation moved from the land to books again, which seemed to be their natural gravity, and from books to the broader question of what the territory was becoming, which was a question that did not have a clean answer but that they approached from the same angle. The sense that it was being built in real time, with all the attendant chaos and injustice and occasional grace of something being made from rough material, without a reliable blueprint. "The Navajo people were here long before any of us," Catherine said at one point, looking out at the land. "I read about the long walk when I was in Cincinnati, 1864. They were forced off their land and marched 300 miles and kept at Bosque Redondo for 4 years. Peter was quiet for a moment. "They were returned to their traditional land in 1868, the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, but return does not mean what was taken was repaid. It means they were allowed to go back to what was left. And we come here and file claims and call it homesteading," she said, not bitterly, but honestly, and with the slight edge of someone who had been turning the thought over. "It is a real tension," Peter said, and he meant it, she could tell, not as something he had decided to agree with because she had said it first, but as something he had been carrying. "I cannot make it right from a sheriff's office, but I can make sure that the law as it exists is applied fairly and that people within my jurisdiction are not cheated or harmed if I can help it." He paused. "It is not enough, but it is what I have." She looked at him in the afternoon light. He was looking out at the land, the line of his jaw against the sky, the gray eyes somewhere far off and then coming back. "It is more than some people manage," she said. He turned and looked at her, and the moment was one of those particular moments that has a quality of stillness about it. Not because nothing is moving, but because everything has arrived at the same place at the same time, and nothing is pulling in a different direction. She felt it, and she could see from the way he held himself that he felt it too, and neither of them moved for a beat that lasted longer than a breath. Then he said, "We should head back before the afternoon heat gets serious," and stood and offered his hand to pull her up, and she took it, and the contact was brief and ordinary and also, she thought, not either of those things at all. On Monday, the stage brought a letter from Santa Fe. It was not the full response Peter had hoped for, but it was a letter of receipt and acknowledgement from the Deputy Territorial Commissioner's office, signed by a man named Hargreaves, confirming that the matter of Alton Marsh's fee practices was under review, and that a formal notice would be sent to Marsh directly requiring him to cease the practice pending full investigation. Peter brought the letter to Catherine at Mrs. Garza's boarding house at noon, which was not something he would necessarily have done for a letter this preliminary, and he acknowledged that to himself while he was walking there. She read it on the boarding house porch with the afternoon brightness full on her face and then looked up. "This is good," she said. "It is a start. Marsh cannot legally require payment now that he has been formally noticed. If he does, he is in violation of a territorial directive and the complaint escalates. How long until the actual transfer is approved? Could be 2 weeks, could be a month, but you have the documentation and the principle is established." He paused. "You might also want to speak to Judge Hennessy when he comes through. He does the circuit about every 3 weeks. He is due in about 10 days. A land transfer with his endorsement moves faster through Santa Fe than without. Where do I find Judge Hennessy?" "He stays here, actually. Mrs. Garza's." She looked at the letter again and then at him. "You know the schedule of every circuit judge in the territory as well as the water table depth under my property. And the stage arrival times," he said, "and the planting calendar for the eastern growing season and the names of everyone within 30 miles. Is that an impressive list or a slightly alarming one?" "Possibly both," he said, and the dry warmth was back in his voice again, and she felt the corner of her mouth lift in something that this time was not almost a smile but an actual one. He looked at it. He looked at her smiling, and she saw something in his face that was careful and intent and warm all at the same time, the face of a man who was allowing himself something he did not allow easily, and she held his gaze and let him look. "There is a thing people do here on Wednesday evenings," he said after a moment. "In the square behind the church, people bring food, there is sometimes a fiddle player, families sit out in the cooling air. It is informal. It is not a formal occasion." "That sounds very much like an invitation to something that you are being very careful not to call a date," she said. He was quiet for exactly 1 second. "It might be," he said. She folded the letter from Santa Fe and put it in her pocket and looked at him with a fullness and an honesty that she did not try to temper or manage. "Then yes," she said. "Wednesday evening." The square behind the church on Wednesday evening was exactly what he had described, which she was coming to understand was a consistent feature of Peter Bristol. He described things accurately. There were maybe 30 people gathered in the warm evening, sitting on blanket-covered ground or on the low wall surrounding the square, with lanterns beginning to glow as the sky went from orange to purple. A man named Cooper who worked at the farrier had a fiddle and was playing something lively and slightly imprecise that everyone seemed to appreciate anyway. There were children running through the gathering dark, and a smell of roasting meat from somewhere nearby, and the general ease of a community that had earned its rest for the day. They sat together near the church wall, close enough that the conversation was easy and private within the ambient noise, and they talked for a very long time about many things and ate the food that circulated through the gathering on plates and in cloth-covered baskets, good simple food that people had made and brought to share. Martha Holt saw them, and her expression went through approximately 6 stages in rapid succession that Catherine catalogued with private amusement. Tom Birch, who materialized near them with the unerring instinct of a 15-year-old with an information obsession, was sent away politely by a look from Peter that Tom obeyed with a speed that suggested he had some sense of the significance of the evening. At one point, Cooper switched to a slower tune, and some people near the center of the square began to dance. Just simple turning dances, nothing formal, and Catherine watched them with a quality of attention that she was not entirely concealing. "Do you dance?" Peter asked. "I do," she said. "I have not in a long time." He stood and offered his hand. She took it, and they walked to where the others were dancing. And he was not a showy dancer, but he was a capable one, which meant he led without pulling and kept good time and managed the space around them without making her feel hurted. She had danced with men who held her like a possession, and men who held her like they were afraid of her, and men who held her like they had forgotten she was there. Peter held her like she was a person he very much wanted to be near, with a respectful care and a warmth that she felt all the way down to something old and careful in her that had not been reached in a considerable while. The song ended and they stood close in the fading light, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the particular quality of that moment was something she knew she would be able to recall in precise sensory detail for the rest of her life. "Catherine," he said quietly, in a voice that was not his sheriff voice or his professional voice, just his own voice, low and steady and private. "I know," she said. And she did. The days that followed were a new country entirely. They were not yet in the full open of it, not declaring anything to anyone, but they both knew the geography had changed, and they walked in it with a consciousness that was new and good, and slightly terrifying in the way that good things are terrifying when you are someone who has been careful for a long time. He came to Mrs. Garza's boarding house porch in the evening when his day was done, most evenings, not everyone, and they talked until the stars came fully out. She began to learn the specific quality of his thoughts, the way he worked through a problem from the outside in rather than the inside out, the way he was more direct about practical things than personal ones, not evasive but considerate, like a man who took his words seriously and did not use them casually. She began to hear the Missouri in his speech, the particular vowels he had mentioned, and the way it came and went depending on what he was talking about, strongest when he was tired or when something moved him. He began to learn the way she thought, which was lateral and associative and sometimes surprising, the way a question about land drainage would lead her to a point about Irish tenant farming that led to a point about the water laws in New Mexico territory that was actually quite sharp, and that he had not considered from that angle. He began to anticipate the almost smile, the moment when her face was deciding whether to show the full thing, and to find he was always pleased when it arrived. Mrs. Garza watched all of this from behind her kitchen curtain, and her face showed nothing, but her hands were somewhat gentler than usual with the dishes. Judge Hennessy arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after Catherine's arrival, a large, cheerful man in his 60s with an elaborate mustache and a voice built for courtrooms, who settled into Mrs. Garza's best room with the satisfied ease of a man who had been doing circuit for 20 years and had long since made his peace with all of it. Catherine introduced herself the evening he arrived, presented her documentation over dinner, and was told by the judge with genuine directness that her claim was solid, and that with the Santa Fe notice on file, he could endorse the transfer without waiting for the full investigation to conclude, which was excellent news. She went to tell Peter that same evening, and she found him on his porch with a cup of coffee, and when she told him he looked pleased in a way that was, she thought, somewhat more than professionally invested in the outcome of her land case. "That is settled then," he said. "Or nearly." "Nearly," she agreed. "The judge will sign the endorsement tomorrow. I should have confirmation of transfer within 2 weeks." She sat down in the other chair on his porch, the one she had come to think of as hers, which was a thought she had noticed and not quite examined yet. The night was warm, and the stars were extravagant in the desert sky the way they were on clear summer nights, thick and generous. "What happens after?" he said after a while. "When you have the transfer, you will go out to the land." "Yes, to build. Yes, I have enough money to start small, 1 room first, then more. I know how to do a great deal of construction because my father taught me and because I have no aversion to learning what I do not know. You will need help. The land is isolated." "I am not afraid of isolated," she said. "I was alone in Cincinnati for 2 years. Being alone somewhere beautiful is considerably better than being alone somewhere ugly." He was quiet. The coffee cup turned in his hand slowly. "Peter," he looked at her. She had been thinking about how to say this for several days, trying to find the precise words that were honest without being more than she was sure of, that said what was true without demanding more than she could reasonably ask for. In the end she decided that precision was not the point and honesty was. "I came here for my father's land and to build something for myself," she said. "I did not come here for anything else. I want you to know that is true." "I know it is true," he said. "But something has happened that I did not plan, and I think you know what it is, and I do not want to pretend I don't feel it if you feel it too." She paused. "Do you?" The desert night held them in its enormous quiet. A coyote called somewhere far off, and the sound rose and faded. "I have been alone for a long time," Peter said. "Not because I had to be, but because nothing felt right enough to change it. I was not looking for anything. I was not expecting anything." He set down the coffee cup. "And then you walked out of Elias Holt's store and almost knocked me over and looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth your attention." She felt the smile come, the full one this time. "And was the decision favorable?" "Apparently," he said, and the way he said it, dry and warm and full of everything he was not saying out loud, made her heart do something it had not done in years. He reached across the space between the chairs and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand and held his hand, and they sat like that in the starlight for a long time and did not need to say anything more for a while. The weeks that followed were a weaving together of two lives that had been separate, and were now learning the shape of each other, cautiously, and with the particular honesty of people who had been careful long enough to know what carelessness cost. He rode out with her twice more to the claim before the transfer was officially confirmed. The first time was practical, surveying what would be needed for the well and the first small structure, and she was a good practical thinker, quick with measurements and materials calculations, and he found himself watching her think with the same pleasure he got from watching anything do exactly what it was built to do. The second time was less practical and more simply the thing they had become for each other. People who enjoyed each other's company in a particular quality of quiet and conversation that did not feel like anything else. On the evening of the day the transfer confirmation arrived, Peter found her at Mrs. Garza's boarding house sitting on the porch with the document in her hands, and her face was the most fully open he had ever seen it, the years of careful reserve set aside completely, and he stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked at her and felt something in him release that had been held taut for a very long time. "It is yours," he said. "It is mine," she said. 40 acres of New Mexico territory legally transferred to Catherine Rourke. She looked up. "My father would have been so pleased. He would have been proud of how you fought for it," Peter said. "You came a very long way alone." She stood and came to the top of the porch steps, which put them at nearly the same height, and she looked at him with everything in her face. "I am very glad I ended up here," she said, in a voice that meant considerably more than the sentence contained. He climbed the 2 porch steps and kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that had no performance in it, no calculation of what it should look like, just the true thing between two people who had been moving toward each other through a great deal of careful distance and had finally arrived. Her hands came up to his jacket lapels and his came to her face, and it was warm and certain, and it tasted like coming home to a place you had never been before. Mrs. Garza, in the kitchen, heard the very significant silence from the porch and did not go near the window. The next 3 months were the months of building, in every sense of the word. Peter organized a working party for the well, something that was common in the territory when a new homesteader was establishing themselves, neighbors coming together for the labor-intensive work that was hard to do alone. Rodriguez from the livery came, and 2 of the Morno brothers, and a man named Sutherland who homesteaded 6 miles north and who had already dug 2 wells of his own, and they spent a full Saturday on Catherine's land working in rotation down into the earth, each man trading off on the difficult arm work, and by the end of the afternoon they had hit good water at 38 feet, which was nearly exactly where Peter had predicted it would be. And Catherine stood at the top of the shaft and looked down at the darkness where the water was, and felt the solidity of her future click into place like a key in a lock. She thanked each man by name and with a specificity that meant they knew she was paying attention, had seen their individual contribution, and every single one of them went home pleased, though none of them could have said precisely why. Peter stayed after the others left. They walked the land in the evening light, 4 full miles of it, and she told him her plans in detail, the garden layout, the direction the first room would face to catch the morning light and deflect the afternoon heat, the fruit trees she intended to plant along the east fence line when she had the resources, the small herd she thought she could manage by her second year if things went as planned. He listened with the focused attention she had come to love and asked practical questions that pushed her plans further rather than questioning whether they were possible. He never asked whether she was sure or whether she had thought this through, which was what most people did when a woman talked about building something. He asked where she planned to source the lumber and whether she had considered adobe construction, which used local materials and performed better in the desert heat. And she had not considered adobe in detail, and so they spent an hour talking about the construction method, and she filed everything he said in the practical part of her mind where it would be used. At one point she turned to him and said, "You are very knowledgeable about homesteading construction for a man who lives behind a sheriff's office." "I helped build it," he said. "When I arrived in Redstone Crossing there was a jailhouse but not the attached house. I built the house myself." She stopped walking. "You built your own house." "It took about 2 months working evenings and weekends. I had help from a few people." He paused. "It was something to do." She looked at him in the fading evening light, this man who built his own house because it was something to do, who knew the water table depth and the circuit judge's schedule and the specific sound of a person's home state in their vowels. She looked at him, and the fullness of what she felt was almost frightening in its completeness. "Peter," she said. He turned. "I think I am in love with you," she said, with the same directness she had applied to everything from the moment she had arrived. No hedging, no conditional phrasing, just the plain fact of it. His face in the fading light went through a particular transition that she would remember always, from the careful steadiness into something open and warm and completely unguarded, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Catherine," he said, and crossed the 2 steps between them, and held her face in his hands with a tenderness that was also certainty, with a certainty that was also something that had been a very long time coming for both of them. "I think I have been in love with you since you almost walked into me on a boardwalk, and then asked me directly whether a government official was cheating you," he said, "which tells you something about my tastes." She laughed, a full laugh, not the almost smile but the real full thing, and his face changed again into something that was pure warmth, and he kissed her there on her 40 acres in the evening light with the cottonwood trees moving very softly in the desert wind. The construction of Catherine's house took most of the autumn. She worked it herself. With help she organized and managed with the efficiency of someone who had been managing things since childhood. The Morneau brothers knew adobe construction and taught her as they worked, and she was a quick learner with strong hands and no ego about being taught. Mrs. Garza came out twice to advise on the kitchen layout, which was Mrs. Garza's particular area of expertise, and which she contributed with the authority of a woman who had thought carefully about practical space. Peter came out most weekends, and on the weekends he was there. They worked the land together with a comfortable shared rhythm that surprised neither of them. He was not a man who tried to take over. He did the work that needed to be done, and he did it alongside her rather than ahead of her. And when he had an opinion, he stated it, and when she had a different opinion, he listened to it without performing patience. She found him to be the most genuinely equal partner she had ever encountered, not because he had adopted a policy about it, but because it was simply how he moved through the world, believing that competence was the relevant quality and that it was distributed without regard to anything else. By November, the main room was finished. It was small but solid, 16 feet square with good thick adobe walls that kept the heat out and the cool in during the day, and reversed that equation at night, with a stone fireplace in the northeast corner and a deep-set window facing east. She moved her things out from Mrs. Garza's boarding house on a Tuesday morning in the cool of the early November air, and she stood in the finished room and looked at the four walls and the fireplace, and the light coming through the east window, and she said thank you, out loud, to the room or to the air or to her father. It was hard to say exactly who, but she said it and meant it. Peter arrived on the Saturday after she moved in with a length of lumber and a specific look on his face that she had come to recognize as the face he wore when he had decided to do something practical and was not quite announcing it yet. He built her a bookshelf along the south wall, fitted to the dimensions of the room, with exactly the right depth for a variety of book sizes, and when she walked back in from seeing to the horse after he had fitted it in and stepped back, she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him. "You measured this," she said. "I looked at the wall when I was here 2 weeks ago," he said. "You looked at a wall and remembered its exact dimensions 2 weeks later. It is not an unusual skill," he said. "It is just paying attention." She went to him and kissed him slowly and with considerable intent, and he held her like she was the most important thing in the room, which she was, which they both knew. On a Sunday evening in late November, when the desert sky was turning its spectacular winter colors of deep orange and violet, and the cold was coming in fast and clear, they were sitting by the fire in Catherine's house with coffee and the comfortable quiet that was by now as natural to them as breathing, and Peter set down his cup and looked at the fire for a moment and then looked at her. Catherine. She knew from the quality of his voice that this was not an ordinary beginning. She looked at him. He was turned toward her with everything in his face, the careful man fully set aside. Just him, just Peter, with 20 years of Missouri and Colorado and New Mexico territory and every closed-off evening and every careful choice and every lonely morning on his face. And under all of it, steady and warm and absolutely certain, the thing she had been watching grow in him for 3 months. "I am going to say something that I have not said to anyone in a considerable time," he said, "and I want to say it right." She set down her own cup and turned to face him fully, with her own fullness, her own 30 years, Ohio and Cincinnati and her father's letters and the long road to these 40 acres, and the person she had built herself into through all of it. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said. "You walked into this town without being sent, and without asking for anything but what was fair, and you have changed the whole composition of my days, and I am better for it in every way I can measure." He paused. "I would like you to consider becoming my wife. Not because the town thinks I should be married, not because it is practical, but because I am profoundly, irrevocably in love with you, and I want to build a life with you, and I believe we would build something extraordinary." She was quiet for the length of several heartbeats, but not the quiet of hesitation, the quiet of someone holding a very large and beautiful thing and wanting to hold it correctly. "I came here for my father's land," she said slowly, "and I found something I did not know I was looking for, which was the only kind of finding that really counts." She looked at him, the full green of her eyes direct and certain and warm. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Peter, I would very much like to marry you." He took her hands, both of them, and held them, and the firelight played over the pair of them in Catherine's small solid house on 40 acres of New Mexico territory. And what was between them in that moment was something so real and so specific to them both that it required no additional description. They were married in the Redstone Crossing church on the 4th Saturday of December, 1878, which was a cold, clear day with a sky so blue it seemed painted on. Reverend Carr performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, and the church was full because, as Peter had observed, it was a small town and people were interested. But it was also full because they had become over the 3 months a kind of center of something, the way certain people are who are genuinely what they appear to be, and the town liked them and wished them well. And that goodwill filled the little crooked-steepled church until it was close to overflowing. Martha Holt wept enthusiastically in the front pew, which everyone was kind enough to receive as sentiment rather than the complicated blend of triumph and bewilderment that it actually was. Elias Holt patted her hand. "Mrs. Garza sat in the third row in her good dress and wore the expression of someone who has known all along how a story was going to go and has simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. Tom Birch sat in the back row and wrote everything he observed in a small notebook, which was his way of marking occasions he considered significant. Rodriguez from the livery stood as Peter's witness, a role he accepted with quiet dignity. Catherine wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from Elias Holt's store, a deep blue-green that made her eyes look like the sea in Irish paintings, and her copper hair was down, simply brushed, with just a few small flowers from the dried winter, stems that Mrs. Garza had helped her find and prepare. She was the most beautiful thing Peter had ever seen in his life, and he did not conceal this from his face, and the whole congregation saw it, and there was a collective warmth in the room that had nothing to do with the poor heating. When Reverend Carr pronounced them married, and Peter took her face in his hands and kissed her, Catherine felt every single mile from Ohio to Cincinnati to this small church in this desert town rise up in her as something not to be mourned but to be honored, each step of it having been necessary to bring her to exactly here. And she kissed him back with everything she had, and someone in the pews said a soft, involuntary sound that was half laugh and half something older and more tender. They moved Catherine's remaining things into the house behind the sheriff's office that Peter had built with his own hands, and then spent their evenings over the winter working out the arrangement of their two lives into one, which required the same combination of practicality and generosity that they both naturally possessed, and so went remarkably well. They kept the 40 acres. This was never in question. The land was Catherine's, and it was good land, and they would build on it. In the spring they would start the second structure, a larger house, properly planned, that would be their permanent home. The sheriff's house in town would do for the winter, and for the nights when Peter had reason to stay close to the office, which was a practical arrangement that both suited them and troubled neither of them. Winter in the desert was cold and clear and long, and they spent evenings by the fire reading to each other, which had started because Peter had been reading when she arrived one evening, and she had said, "What are you on?" and he had told her, and she had said, "That was where I stopped last winter," and he had said, "Shall I go back?" And so he had, and they had read 3 chapters together before the fire burned down, and after that it became the natural shape of winter evenings. He learned her insomnia, which visited about once a week, and on those nights he would find her in the kitchen with a lamp and a book, and he would make coffee and sit with her without asking why she was awake, because she did not entirely know why, and she appreciated not being asked to explain. She learned his early morning quality, the way he was most himself in the first hour of the day before the full weight of his responsibilities came down on him, and she began to wake with him and watch the desert light come in through the east window of the small house while they drank the good coffee he made. They argued twice in the winter, genuinely, not the polite disagreements of people performing compatibility, but real arguments about real things, one about the timing of moving to the claim, and one about a decision Peter made professionally that she thought was wrong and said so clearly. Both arguments had the shape of arguments between people who respect each other, full of actual positions genuinely held and the willingness to be wrong when the evidence required it, and both ended with a clarity and a closeness that was different from, and better than, the state they had been in before the argument. She thought afterward that this was how you knew it was real, not that you did not argue, but that the arguing made you more certain rather than less. In late January, she discovered she was carrying a child. She told Peter on a Tuesday evening when he came in from the office, and she was standing by the kitchen stove with a particular expression that he read immediately as significant, not because it was obvious but because he had become, over 3 months of close and paying attention, very literate in Catherine's face. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands. "What is it?" She looked up at him and did not quite know yet what expression belonged on her face, because the feeling was too large and too new to have found its form yet. "We are going to have a child," she said. He looked at her for a moment with everything going through him. She could see it moving through him. And then his face settled into something that was the fullest version of him she had ever seen, warm and certain and overwhelmed in the very best sense of the word. And he gathered her into his arms and held her against him with a care that was enormous and completely without reservation. "When?" he said, against her hair. "August, I think. Maybe late July." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you all right? Are you frightened?" She thought about this honestly. "I am not frightened exactly," she said. "I am very large feeling, like the world got considerably bigger in a very short time." "I know that feeling," he said, and she understood he meant her arrival, the size and change of it. They were quiet together for a while in the kitchen with the stove's warmth and the desert cold outside and the particular feeling of standing at the beginning of a new country. Spring came, and with it the full work of the claim. They began the larger house in March, a proper 2-room structure with plans for a 3rd room added on, using the same adobe construction as the first room, but with everything Peter had learned about thermal efficiency, and everything Catherine had learned about what a working house needed. The Morneau brothers came back, and Rodriguez and Sutherland, and Mrs. Garza came out on Saturdays to supervise the kitchen wall placement with an authority that no one thought to question. And by May the shell was up and the roof was on, and they were working the interior. Catherine worked the construction even as her pregnancy grew visible, doing the lighter work and the planning and the directing with an authority that had long since been established, and that no one in the working party questioned, because she knew exactly what she was doing and they all knew it. Peter worked beside her and kept a careful eye on her without making her feel watched, which was a distinction he understood and maintained. The kitchen garden was planted in April, the seeds ordered from a catalog during the winter, and planned with a thoroughness that Elias Holt had admired when she came in to collect the order. She had read everything she could find about growing in the desert climate, and had written to a woman in Arizona Territory, whose husband had written an article in a farming periodical about water-efficient kitchen garden management. And the woman had written back with 3 pages of highly specific advice that Catherine had copied into a dedicated journal, and was now implementing with the methodical energy of someone who had been planning this for months. There were tomatoes and squash and beans and 3 kinds of pepper, and a section for herbs and a separate small plot that she had designated for flowers, not practical flowers but beautiful ones, because her mother had always had flowers, and because the land was hers and it would have what she chose. The fruit trees went in along the east fence in May. Apples and a peach and 2 pear trees, small and hopeful in their new holes, staked against the desert wind. She walked the fence line after planting them and looked at each small stake and felt the future in them, the years it would take them to establish and grow, the way she was planting not for this year, but for 10 years from now, for 20, for the person who would stand in this orchard when she was old and pick fruit from trees she had put in the ground in the spring of 1879. Peter stood beside her at the end of the fence line, watching her face as she looked at the trees. 10 years, he said. 12 for the apples probably, she said, but pears are faster. He took her hand. She was 7 months along by then, visibly so, and the weight of the child was changing how she moved, a fact she observed with interest rather than complaint. He held her hand and they looked at the small brave trees, and the desert stretched out beyond the fence line toward the mountains that were blue and permanent and had been there before all of them and would be there long after. "What do you want to name him?" she said. He looked at her. "Him? I think so. I cannot be certain, but I have thought so since January." He was quiet for a moment, turning the question over with the care he turned all questions over. "Patrick," he said, "if that is all right with you." She felt the warmth of that come up through her, full and unexpected and perfect. "Patrick," she said, "Patrick Bristol. Patrick Rourke Bristol," he said. "All of it." She looked at him with everything she was, which was considerable, and he looked back at her with the same, and the desert and the mountains and the small hopeful trees were around them, and it was enough and more than enough and exactly right. Their son was born on a night in late July, when the desert air was warm and full of stars, and the coyotes were singing their distant songs to the dark. He arrived with the kind of emphatic announcement that suggested he had his opinions about being in the world and intended to share them, which he did, loudly and with great conviction, for several minutes before settling into the particular newborn gravity that follows first fury. Mrs. Garza was there, who had declared herself indispensable on the subject, and had been proven correct. She was calm and capable and exactly what was needed, and when she placed the wrapped infant in Catherine's arms she said, in a voice that was softer than her usual register, "There he is. Look at that boy." Peter was on the other side of the bed holding Catherine's hand, with a grip that had been white-knuckled for the last 2 hours, and that now eased slowly as his face went through a transformation that Catherine, even in her exhaustion and relief, witnessed with the clear attention she gave to things she wanted to remember. He looked at his son. He looked at the small, furious face, already calming, already examining the world with the particular expression of someone with opinions about it. He looked at him for a long time with absolute stillness, and then he looked at Catherine, and what was in his face in that moment was everything that had brought them here from 2 different starting points across all the hard and beautiful distance of American geography, and it was sufficient to fill any room and overflow it. "Patrick Rourke Bristol," he said, quietly, like a name that had been waiting to be given. "Hello, Patrick," Catherine said, to the small, warm weight in her arms, in a voice she did not know she had until that moment, a voice that had come from somewhere entirely new. Redstone Crossing took the news of the baby the way small western towns took everything, with rapid and thorough distribution of information, and a general outpouring of practical assistance. The boarders at Mrs. Garza's organized a collection for household necessities. Martha Holt delivered a quilt she had been making since March with the serene certainty of someone who had known this outcome was coming. Tom Birch presented himself at the Claim house 3 days after the birth and asked if he could hold the baby, and was permitted to do so under supervision, and sat with Patrick in his arms with an expression of the most genuine and uncomplicated wonder that either Peter or Catherine had seen on his perpetually alert young face. "He looks at things," Tom said, in a tone of discovery. "He does," Peter agreed, "like he is deciding what he thinks." "He comes by that honestly," Peter said, and looked at Catherine across the room, and she raised her eyebrow at him in a way that made Mrs. Garza, in the kitchen, smile to herself. The autumn of 1879 settled into them, the family and the claim and the town, and the life that had been built from the raw material of 2 separate people's determination. The house on the claim was finished by September, proper and solid in theirs, with the bookshelf from the small townhouse moved out to the new building and fitted along the wall of the main room, already full. Peter made the ride into town most days, because the sheriff's job did not stop for domesticity, and Catherine managed the claim with the focused competence that was her natural state, with Patrick in a carrier on her back for the first months, and then, as he grew, in a pen in the shade near wherever she was working. She was planting her second season's garden by the time he could sit unassisted, and could discuss the layout with the baby on her lap, which he received with the calm gravity of someone following the general idea without the specific details, which she found perfectly suitable for a 7-month-old. On the evenings Peter came home to the Claim house, the 3 of them had a life that was simple and full and thoroughly theirs. They ate dinner together and talked over the day and read by the fire when the evenings turned cold, taking turns with Patrick, who had a great deal of opinion about books being read aloud to him, and expressed these opinions in a growing vocabulary of sounds that they were learning to interpret. He was, in the combined estimation of his parents, the most interesting person they had ever met, and they were not even slightly impartial about this, but did not attempt to pretend otherwise. Alton Marsh, whose practices were eventually fully investigated by the Territorial Land Office, was removed from his position in March of 1880 and replaced by a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had come from Santa Fe, and who ran the office with a transparency and fairness that caused Martha Holt to declare it the best thing to happen to the county land records in living memory, which may have been an exaggeration, but was not by very much. Peter served as sheriff of Redstone Crossing for 4 more years beyond his first term, reappointed without opposition each time because he was the kind of sheriff that made a town feel that justice was a real and available thing rather than a theoretical concept. He was known throughout the territory as a man of particular integrity, which he accepted without ceremony and without it changing him in any measurable way. The orchard grew. The pear trees gave their first real fruit in the 3rd year, small and sweet and extraordinary, and Catherine stood in the October morning light with a pear in each hand, and felt the satisfaction of having planned something years in advance, and having the world cooperate with the plan, which it did not always do, but when it did was deeply gratifying. Their second child was a boy too, born in the spring of 1882, and they named him Elias James Bristol, James for Peter's father who had been a good man in Missouri, and Elias because Elias Holt had been a genuinely useful neighbor for nearly 4 years, and because the name suited the sturdy, observant baby who seemed immediately to be taking stock of everything around him. Their third child, born 2 years after that, was a girl, and they named her Rose, for no complicated reason except that Catherine had always liked the name, and because she had a small rose bush near the front door of the claim house by then that bloomed every May in a color that was almost exactly the color of her daughter's first cheeks, and the coincidence seemed worth honoring. They were 5. The claim house had grown to 3 rooms and a covered porch that ran along the south side and collected the afternoon sun in winter and the desert breeze in summer, and the bookshelf had been expanded twice and was filled with an extensive and eclectic collection that reflected 2 people's worth of reading lives. The orchard ran the length of the east fence and gave fruit in good seasons and hope in hard ones. Tom Birch grew into a young man and eventually went to study law in Santa Fe, where he wrote careful letters back to Peter that were full of legal argument and the particular excitement of someone discovering that the system he had been watching from a sheriff's office doorway for years had rules that could be learned and used. And Peter wrote back with advice that was specific and honest, and always treated Tom as the capable person he had always been becoming. Mrs. Garza's boarding house continued to operate, and she continued to watch the world from behind her kitchen curtain with the comprehensive intelligence of someone who had seen a great deal of it and drawn accurate conclusions. And she came to the claim house for Christmas every year and held Rose, and played a complicated card game with Patrick and Elias that she always won, which the boys found infuriating and educational in equal measure. Martha Holt declared, in a moment of complete sincerity at a church social in 1884, that Peter Bristol and Catherine Rourke were the single greatest success of her work. And when Peter, who was standing near enough to hear this, said with perfect dryness that he was fairly sure Martha had had nothing to do with it, she said that she had always known he needed someone who had not been sent, and that this was exactly what she had meant to arrange and had simply arranged from a distance. He did not argue with this, because arguing with Martha Holt was a demonstration of persistence without yield, and also because he was in too good a humor to bother. Catherine, beside him, heard the exchange and took his hand and said nothing, but smiled the full smile, the one that had started as an almost in the doorway of a general store in the autumn of 1878, and had, over the years, become simply her face in happiness, which was a face he had come to know as well as his own, and to love with the full attention of a man who had learned, through much careful living, exactly what was worth paying attention to. On a September evening in 1885, Peter and Catherine Bristol sat on the south porch of their claim house, while the desert light went through its evening colors, and the three children were inside in various states of dinner and argument, and the ordinary noise of a family in motion. The mountains on the horizon were purple and final, and the first stars were coming out above them. "Do you remember," Catherine said, "the first time you brought me out here, on horseback, to show me what the land was?" "I remember everything about that day," he said. "I stood in the middle of it and turned around in a circle, trying to see all of it at once. I know, I watched you." She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the orchard and the kitchen garden, and the well with its stone surround that had been built in the second year when the original timber frame needed replacing, and the fence line with its grown and bearing trees. She looked at all of it. 40 acres of New Mexico territory that her father had dreamed about and she had fought for, and they had together made into something real. "I was very good at almost smiling in those days," she said. "I had not fully committed. I noticed the almost smiles," he said. "They were extremely compelling. I was not sure I would survive an actual one." She laughed, and he felt it against his shoulder and tilted his head to rest against her hair. "I had turned every other thing away before this," he said after a moment. "Every possibility, every practical arrangement. I could not have told you why exactly. I only knew that something was missing, and I did not want the shape of the thing without the substance. And then a woman almost knocked me over outside a general store and asked me directly whether a government official was dishonest, and I thought, there it is." She lifted her head and looked at him in the evening light with everything in her face, every year of it, every choice and every mile and every morning in this house, and every child and every book and every argument and every night by the fire. "There it is," she said. He kissed her, as he had on their wedding day, as he had on the evening of the transfer, as he had in the field by the cottonwood trees, with no performance, just the true thing, which was love in its complete and daily form. The kind that was not dramatic but was everything. The kind that stood in orchards and watched children grow and sat on porches in the desert dark, and was still, after all the years and all the building, absolutely itself. Inside the house, Patrick was telling Elias that he had won the card game, and Elias was disputing this with logical arguments that were nearly correct. And Rose was singing something she had made up to herself by the fire, and the evening came down over Redstone Crossing, and all its 40 acres, and all its good solid houses, and all its people, ordinary and extraordinary in the way that people are when they are living lives that are genuinely, fully theirs. The mountains held their permanent positions on the horizon. The stars came out in their extravagant desert numbers. The coyotes called their ancient, indifferent songs to the cooling dark. And Peter and Catherine Bristol sat on their south porch in the warm remains of a September evening, and were, in every sense that counted and in every way that could be measured, exactly where they were supposed to be.